Alright, conditional access policy for Azure Virtual Desktop is one of those things which sounds simple until you try to implement it. Then you realize there's about 5 different level of complexity layers which you did not expect. Here's why this matters. AVD sessions are accessing your corporate information, your sensitive data, your corporate applications, and everything else that user has been given access to. If you don't have proper conditional access policy in place, you're basically allowing anyone with stolen credential to access your system from anywhere in the world. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through how to set up conditional access policy for your Azure Virtual Desktop environment. We are going to spend most of our time in Azure portal building these policies step by step. I'll show you the configuration, the gotchas, and specific settings that you need to pay attention while working in production environment. Before we proceed, if you missed out on our last video on Azure Virtual Desktop implementation, go check it out. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please click the subscribe button and come join my learning community. Now, here's what we are covering today. First, I will show you the basic structure of the conditional access policy and why AVD requires a specific approach. And then we are going to build a real policy in Azure together. And finally, I'll show you some advanced scenario like handling guest users and different security requirements for different user groups. So before we jump into the portal, let me explain why conditional access policy for AVD is different from your typical CA policy. When a user connects to the Azure Virtual Desktop, they're not authenticating just once. There are actually two authentications taking place. The first authentication is to AVD itself, and that's the control plane. Then they authenticate to actual session host, and that's the data plane. And this is where it gets interesting. If you just create a generic policy for all the cloud apps, you might think that it covers AVD, but it doesn't work the way you expect it, because AVD has specific app IDs that you need to target. And if you miss even one of them, the policy won't even apply correctly. So key thing to understand here is conditional access policy for AVD require targeting multiple applications, and you need to think about both initial connection and the session host. Let's jump into the Azure portal and I'll show you exactly where these policies live and how do we configure them. Alright, so I'm here in Microsoft Entra Admin Center. You can do the same stuff in Azure portal as well. All you need to do is go to your Microsoft Entra ID, scroll down to security and choose conditional access. For sake of simplicity, so we'll just do it right here. I will choose conditional access under the Entra ID and click on policies. And you can see I already have one policy in place, which is to enforce MFA for all the users. I'll go ahead and click new policy. I'm going to call this something AVD-require MFA and compliant device. The naming convention is really important. It tells me that this is an AVD policy and what that policy does. You want to be very descriptive with your policy name, because when you have 20 or 30 of these, you need to know what exactly each one of them does. Alright, so now let's configure the assignments. First, we need to select the users that we want to assign here. I'm going to click on select user and group and choose a user and a group that I want to assign. We also have a few options to exclude users. So if you don't want anybody to be part of it, if they happen to be in one of those groups and you don't want them to get this policy applied to them, you can come here and select certain people that you don't want this policy to be assigned to. For this demo, I'll just keep it to 2 groups and 1 user which is not part of the assignment, and move to the second option, which is the target resources. This is where most people mess this up. Click on the target resources. Instead of choosing all resources, which used to be all cloud app, what you're going to do is click on select resources here and then click on select specific resource. What we are going to target here is AVD. So I will search for Azure Virtual Desktop, and you can already see we have 2 applications as part of our tenant, which is default in every single tenant in Azure. Out of these 2, the only one that I need right now is one that starts with 9CD. So I will select that and click select. Alright, the next application you need is Windows 365. Search through that in the search window and then select again. With those 2 selected, I'm going to move to network and keep everything as default. This is where you could select if you want to enforce people to log in from your specific location or not. But the main piece that we are going to configure is the conditions. So let's get on the conditions section. Let me walk you through the most important ones that we need for AVD. First one is the location. This is really useful if you want to block access from certain countries or allow any connection from specific location. For this demo, I'm not going to configure it, but you can do that. Configure any trusted location or choose your own network if you have one. The next one is the device platform. This lets you choose any specific operating system that you want to allow. So if you have your organization using Windows mainly, then you might want to block any other operating system to be able to log into your AVD environment. So for now, I'll just choose Windows and click done. And here's what we have: the client apps. This is usually fine to leave as default, which covers browser and the mobile applications. And there are some other configurations you could do if you are collecting any user risk metrics or sign-in risk metrics from your Entra tenant. You could potentially have them feed data into this and allow or disallow user based on their risk level. So that way you're being more proactive on if anybody is detected as risky, you automatically block them from logging into your AVD environment. So next piece is the grant access control. This is where the magic happens. This is pretty much mandatory. You have to configure and tell how you want people to be able to log in. We always keep this on grant access. The very first thing I do here is make sure the MFA is turned on and that people in my organizations are using multi-factor authentication when they are logging into these AVD environments. You also want to mark the device to be compliant for people to be able to log into the AVD environment securely. And if you're using Entra ID and Intune join, you might want to turn on the hybrid join device. This is mainly for devices that are joined on premises to on-prem AD and also Azure AD. And finally, you can choose whether you want this control to be running simultaneously or optionally. I usually keep it on require all. So user is able to log in if they have MFA, if the device is compliant, and if it's an on-prem device joined to the hybrid Entra ID. In most enterprise scenarios, I see organizations requiring MFA for everyone, but only requiring compliant devices for accessing any sensitive information. So the baseline AVD policy, I would select require MFA, require the device to be compliant. Then I would select require one of these controls because I know we already are doing enough to make sure the device is compliant and the user is authenticated. Let's look at the session controls here for a second before we create this policy. This is where you can configure things like sign-in frequency, how often the user need to re-authenticate. For AVD, I typically see organizations setting this to 8 or 12 hours. So even if a user stays connected after 8 hours, they'll still need to re-authenticate. So I'm going to set this to 8 hours and set the sign-in frequency. There are a couple other options such as persistent browser sessions, customize continuous session, which you can delve into if that's something you need. For now, I will keep the report only mode enabled before I click on the create button. This is really important so that I can start monitoring what's happening before I try to enforce any of the policy. You can review this log for a few days and make sure everything is working as expected, and then you can come back and switch it to the on mode. All right, now that we have the policy created, let me show you how to actually test this and make sure it's working. The best place to do that is under sign in logs. Look under the monitoring section and click on sign in logs. And this is all within the same conditional access policy view. So you don't have to leave this portal at all. What we are looking for here is mainly under the applications, anything that says Azure Virtual Desktop Client or Windows app. This tells us that this user has been trying to log into the Windows app web portal and also Azure AVD client. If you have a lot of logs and are not able to find, you can also click on the filter and select application, and you can type in the actual name of the application, in this case Windows Virtual Desktop Client. Make sure your spelling is correct, and I will start seeing just the logs with the matching application name. I'll go ahead and remove the filter since I want to look at this user specifically on which portals they have logged in and what the policy looks like. So I can see there's been one error with the login phase on the Windows web app, but otherwise user was able to log in. And more importantly, I'm looking for AVD client application in this case. Once you click on the log itself, you'll see a bunch of information around which application is involved. In this case, this is the application ID, the resource ID itself, where the user is trying to log in from, what kind of browser they're using, and also if there is anything specific that the system is able to capture for that particular user. For the conditional access policy review, we have to go to conditional access. Once you're in the conditional access policy, you'll see what the regular MFA policy looks like, which doesn't have a whole lot of configuration other than the multi-factor authentication. But if I go back to the sign-in logs again and click on the report only, that's where our MFA AVD policy is sitting, which is just in the report only mode. And you can see what's happening here. The user was able to log in, the resource match was done, we were able to identify the resource involved, which the user requested the access to. And then we can see there's no sign-in risk setup in place, and it also did not find anything. But we did put the filter on to allow only Windows devices, which it correctly found out and said this is not a match. So next time if the policy is turned on, the login request would be blocked. All the other settings were left as it is, so we didn't really configure any of those. The MFA we already know that is in place and was enforced by this policy, so it's been shared with other policy as well, which is totally fine. As long as the policy is in place and working, the MFA is enforced. Alright, let me show you some more complex scenarios that I run into with my clients. First scenario, you have an internal employee and external guest. You probably want different security requirements for each group. For the employee, you may be okay with just the MFA. For the guest user accessing the AVD, you might want to require MFA plus a compliant device plus location restriction. The way you handle this is by creating separate policy for user access type. So you would have one policy targeting your internal employees and another policy which is much stricter targeting all the guest users. Now here's a different scenario. Different AVD host pools with different security requirements. Maybe you got a host pool for general office employees and one for developer who need elevated access. The challenge is conditional access policy doesn't let you specifically target the host pools when creating the policy. You're targeting the AVD app as a whole. So how do you handle this scenario? The way I've seen this done is using different enter ID groups for different host pools. And then you create a specific conditional access policy targeting those specific enter ID groups. So your AVD developer group might have less restriction than AVD finance group. It's a bit of a management overhead, but it gives you the granular control that you need. So here's a big picture that I need to warn you about. If you're using FSLogix profile container for Azure Files, you have conditional access policy that block location. In that scenario, you can run into the issues where session host can't mount the profile. This is because the session host itself is trying to access the Azure files and the container profile. And when it does that, it's hitting your conditional access policy. The fix for this is to exclude the session host service principals from your conditional access policy, or to create specific groups that allow access to your AVD network from where the session host and the AVD environment lives. You would do this by going to Entra ID, named locations, and creating a named location for your AVD network. And then in your conditional access policy, you simply exclude that location. This is one of those things which is not obvious from the documentation, but I have had to troubleshoot this multiple times with clients. So there you have it. We have walked through setting up conditional access policy for Azure Virtual Desktop environment, all the way from basic policy setup to the advanced scenarios which may come up in your production environment. The key takeaway is to target both the application, the AVD control plane, and the client app IDs. Always start with the report only mode and use the sign-in logs to understand if there is any access issues with the users. And remember, conditional access policy is not set it and forget it thing. You need to monitor it, review the sign-in logs, and change the policy over time as the need arise. If you've got a question about this, or any scenario that I've missed and have not covered, drop a comment and let me know. I would love to hear what challenges you are facing with your AVD environments. If you found this helpful, please make sure you subscribe to the channel. I've got more AVD deep dives coming up. I will see you in the next one. Until then, stay curious and keep building.